Sabado, gugulitain ang unang taong anibersaryo ng pag-agupit ni Yolanda sa Central Philippines. Apektado ang sinasabing 14 na milyong Pilipino. Nasawi ang may 6,000 mamamayan, meron pang nawawala. Nawala ng tahanan na may 4 na milyong mamamayan. Tumugon ang pamahalaan kasama ang mga pambansang ahensya at mga kaibigang bansa. Nagtulungan ng mga banyaga at mga Pilipino mula sa pamahalaan at non-government organizations. Meron pa rin 25,000 kataong naghahanap ng matitirhan. Nasa transitional site sila ngayon at mga kailangan ng tulong upang makaligtas. So, merong tanggapang binuo, the President organized a new office to take charge of recovery and rehabilitation. And this is the Office of the Presidential Assistant for Rehabilitation and Recovery. And there is Department of Social Welfare and Development will back them up. This morning we have with us friends from the Philippine Red Cross. And today, the representative of Chairman Dick Gordon is no other than our good friend, Edgar Salve. He's the Senior Disaster Response Manager of the Philippine Red Cross. We have Joe Curry of the Catholic Relief Services. He'll give us an idea of what's going on sa kanilang mga lugar na pinaglilingkuran. Narito rin po si Atty. Karen Jimeno, ang Director ng Communications ng Office of the Presidential Assistant for yung rehabilitation and recovery. And of course, mamaya makakasama natin ang isang doktor, si Dr. Edgar Posadas ng PHAP. Kasama ko rin si Sky Ortigas, ang aking co-host ngayong araw na ito. Mabuti naman at nagkaroon ka, Sky, ha?
Magandang umaga, Sir Melo. Magandang umaga sa ating mga guests.
Alright, let's start. From the Red Cross, CRS, and the OPAR, anong sitwasyon? What's the prevailing situation on the ground? How is it today in Yolanda affected areas? From the Philippine Red Cross, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank Sir Melo on behalf of the PARC Chairman and CEO, Honorable Richard Gordon, and our Secretary General, Dr. Gwendolyn for inviting us. For the Philippine Red Cross, still ongoing pa rin po yung aming mga effort on the recovery program. There are still some challenges, but we are coping in a way that we're able to implement most of our program on time. Right now, we are more involved in shelter construction, both core shelter, shelter repair assistance, the livelihood provision, and more on classroom reconstructions and health facility construction. Plus, we have the integration of the community and school disaster risk reduction, as this will be more on the transition to recovery to development program.
I see. From the Catholic Relief Services, please.
From CRS has been working in shelter, livelihoods, water, and sanitation for the last 12 months. We need to recognize that these communities transition very, very quickly from the relief phase into the recovery phase. And it's been extraordinary to watch, but the recovery needs are extremely high. Right now, the humanitarian community estimates that over 95,000 households are in need of shelter assistance to rebuild. That's not counting those who need to be relocated. And this is where CRS has been working most, especially also with our church partners. To date, we've been able to assist 3,000 families with core shelters and have 5,000 more in progress. And then in livelihoods, especially those coconut farmers who've been devastated by Yolanda, we've been working with them to find alternate livelihoods, diversified livelihoods in agriculture and fisheries, and now looking in training opportunities to help them find new locations.
How much have you spent so far?
CRS by itself has spent about 1 billion pesos, about $23 million in the past year.
Have you coordinated local government agencies, national agencies to identify who really needs the assistance?
Yes, so CRS, we work very closely with the diocese through their church parish structures, through the basic ecclesiastical communities, and then we help to mobilize volunteers, and those volunteers play a very key role in identifying who are the key, what are the key needs in the communities and who are the beneficiaries. We have also worked very closely with the LGUs, the municipal level, provincial level, cities, and then with the DSWD. With the United Nations, we work closely with the cluster coordination structures.
Really. Attorney Jimeno, welcome to the program. This is your first appearance since we started this program. The President signed the 167 billion pesos master plan. What did it take so long? Why did it take so long for the President to approve the budget?
Well, of course, I wish I knew the whole story because we submitted the rehabilitation plan as early as August 1, 2014. But again, this is an 8,000-page document. 8,000 pages, 8 volumes. So when it comes to the law, there's really accountability when you approve a program or a project. So to just give an overview of the extent of the detail of this comprehensive master plan, up to the barangay level, all the projects are listed in this master plan and all the funding requirements. So I guess for their part, what they wanted to do was to make sure that before they approve it, all the projects, one, are verified. Although at that point, at the time that we submitted the comprehensive rehabilitation plan, this was vetted by all of the national government agencies that we organized into clusters to make sure that the plans and projects meet the needs from a national perspective and then a local perspective. Kaya nga to describe it, parang top-down and bottom-up approach combined. Because we asked each of the government agencies that are relevant to rehabilitation to give their cluster action plans. They were organized into clusters. Para meron tayong infrastructure cluster, resettlement cluster for the relocation or building ng permanent housing units to safe zones. And then you have the social services cluster, which covers health, education, and transitional shelters, and also food security. And then you have livelihood, of course, for the livelihood programs. And then we even made what we call the support cluster para dun sa mga cross-cutting policy concerns. We have here kasama yung mga issues on policies like custom duties that are charged on cash or on donations in kind, for instance, which is really a bottleneck, diba? It's really burdensome for a rehabilitation process. So hopefully what we're doing in this rehabilitation process can translate into one, policy reforms, and next, best practices that can help future rehabilitations. But again, for that rehabilitation plan, at least now it's already approved. It's worth 167 billion. So this will start the massive implementation of programs and projects around the Yolanda corridor.
Okay, I should have asked you the question, what triggered the President to sign the document? Because you submitted it by August 1st, and then he signed it about 4 days ago. So what could have triggered him to sign the proposal? But that's another story. Have you made a study as to the Red Cross activities, Catholic Relief Services? Have you factored in their contributions in the first place?
Yes. I'm happy to say that Red Cross is one of those agencies that also works closely with PARR. If you look at Memorandum Order 62, which is the memorandum order that created our office last December 6, the mandate includes unifying all efforts with respect to rehabilitation, both from the government and non-government sector. So as early as January 7, when the PARR, that office or position, was only made up of 2 people. It was Secretary Lacson and Undersecretary Danny Antonio. So only 2 people at that time. The government did not really appoint people under him right away, but one thing he did to fast-track the rehabilitation process was to call on the private sector right away. So as early as January 7, nung wala pa siyang staff, he already set up a meeting with members of the private sector. And what he did was to organize all the 171 cities and municipalities into 24 areas para madaling tignan, and then asked the private sector to help out in those areas. So I'm proud to say as of this date, there have been several project turnovers of completed projects, both from, not only both, but from the livelihood to housing sector to health, meaning hospitals, even the Tacloban City Hospital, it was already turned over, and it's much consistent with the Build Back Better, it is much better than the hospitals available in Tacloban. So I think what is good to emphasize here is that if you look at the master rehabilitation plan, it also includes the mechanisms on how to engage the private sector or the non-government sector. So we factored in that. It's in the master plan, nakalagay dito, the actual contributions both in projects and in cash coming from the non-government sector, from the private sector, and even from multilateral and bilateral agencies, even the amount of grants available. So we really gave a full picture. Public sector, meaning government, and the non-government sector. And Red Cross, they reported to us the amount of shelters that they've been building and have completed.
Really? Sky?
So I would like to add, are you just, especially for CRS, I would just center it Tacloban because there are other areas as well that have been affected by the virus?
CRS has worked in Eastern Leyte, 4 different municipalities and the city of Tacloban, and in 5 municipalities in Eastern Samar.
All right. What basically ails the communities affected by the typhoon? What are their prime needs today? Joe, from your end, before we ask the Red Cross.
The prime needs now outstanding is shelter and livelihoods, water, sanitation. Those are the needs that echo most. Going forward, shelter is the #1 priority, the biggest gap that needs to be filled. So we know that many families need to be relocated in some cases where they live in danger areas, especially parts of urban areas of Tacloban, peri-urban areas in Eastern Leyte. It may be more contentious in other areas, but in those regards, they need a key message. What is their future? Can they rebuild where they are, or do they need to relocate? The other neglected caseload is on-site. Families who can rebuild where they safely live now, but they need assistance. They're living in makeshift shelters, usually using tarpaulins, any kind of salvage material from their previous homes, and they need to build a stronger house to be safe from future storms. In addition, it's livelihoods. So prior to the typhoon, the poorest families were coconut laborers, farmers, and now they've been devastated from Typhoon Yolanda. They need alternate livelihoods.
So even before the typhoon, they've been poor already. And now they lost their property, they lost their livelihood. They can have a home, all right, but how will they survive? What programs have you?
CRS, we're working closely now with TESDA and DTI to give trainings to families. So this could be to give alternate agricultural livelihoods. It could be backyard gardening or swine raising. It could be planting new crops. We're looking at cassava, corn, vegetables as alternate value chains for families to engage in while they watch their coconut grow back. The other is more vocational training, and TESDA has been a very strong partner for us up to date, both in Eastern Samar and in Leyte. So training both rural and urban families on how to be welders, carpenters, how to do other kind of vocations that are also in high demand.
I'd like to ask you, how do you identify your beneficiaries? This is one question that should be answered really, no? So how do you identify your beneficiaries?
We engage community organizers. So our key staff, we bring them from the communities themselves. So community organizers who go into the communities, identify needs. We do a lot of focus groups where the beneficiaries themselves say what are their needs. In many cases, people have recovered. They don't need the external assistance as much, but there are still many in the communities who need the external assistance, especially for shelter and livelihoods and water sanitation.
Thank you. What about the Red Cross? How do you identify your beneficiaries?
For the Red Cross, actually, we are working right now in 9 provinces. We engage with the community. We create what we call barangay recovery committee. We train the community on the selection of beneficiary and registration. It is where the community first identify the most vulnerable who are in need of the shelter, livelihood. And the Red Cross, with our technical team, they are the one to verify it. So it's a participatory approach with the barangay. and of course with the consultation with the local government.
Okay. As far as your office is concerned, how do you identify your beneficiaries?
It depends on what sector. So for instance, if we're talking about resettlement, it's really for those that lost homes, meaning either totally damaged, but they are in unsafe areas, meaning they need to be relocated into permanent homes in safe areas. That's why it took a long time because to build all of the needs for the permanent shelters, because there are about 205,128 permanent housing units that need to be rebuilt in safe areas. But one of the biggest bottlenecks that we faced was actually finding safe relocation sites that are big enough to accommodate all of these housing projects that are not agricultural lands, that are not forest lands, and that are not privately owned. Because privately owned means it would have to go through an eminent domain process. So with respect to finding beneficiaries, for instance, for housing, those are the main criteria. But with respect to livelihood, basically there have been cash for work programs. So it's basically all of those that if you have a head of the family or someone that cannot work, then you can qualify for a cash for work program. This was during the early phases, but livelihood is basically fisher folk, farmer beneficiaries. So it's really based on which sector we're talking about and what type of program is being offered. But in terms of health, for instance, for medical missions or even regional health centers, it's the same, it's base need. So for those who need medical assistance, then they qualify for the health programs offered under the social services cluster.
So I'd just like to ask, how long will this whole rehabilitation will take place?
I'd like to pick up on what Joe said earlier na actually there's been the transition from recovery to rehabilitation is happening very quickly. Actually, it happened quickly. Last July 4, 2014, the DSWD, in conjunction with officials of the UN OCHA, announced that we have transitioned from the relief to recovery phase, and that's in a period of 8 months, which is actually faster than the average 12-month period for most countries. But in terms of the rehabilitation, let's look at the size of the damage, because Banda Aceh, they achieved full rehabilitation and recovery after 8 years. And for Hurricane Katrina, they saw meaningful signs of recovery after 4 years, and they achieved full rehabilitation after 8 years as well. If you look at the size of the damage left by Yolanda, it's still the strongest typhoon to make landfall in recorded history, and the size of the damage is bigger than in Aceh Nias in Indonesia or the tsunami recovery. So I don't think though that we're not shooting for 8 years. We're definitely shooting for faster than 8 years. So if you look at the comprehensive rehabilitation plan, as early as 2016, our target is to achieve that full rehabilitation under the principle of Build Back Better with an 80% completion target. So if you look at all the plans and programs in 2016, we classified short-term as up to 2014, medium-term as 2015 to 2016, and long-term is beyond 2016. But in terms of funding, the release of the funds, the bulk of it will come out 2015. That's about 80 plus billion pesos. It's going to be 80.31 billion pesos, and for 2016, the remaining 38.93 billion pesos. As of today, the total releases from the government have already amounted to 51.98 billion pesos. So the point here is that we want majority or basically almost near 100% completion of the projects by 2016. But we do recognize that when you're talking about building back better, lalo na yung mga building resiliency, it would take really a long-term process. So some of our livelihood projects are actually meant to be completed. Yung mga long-term talaga, that means it's going to be very sustainable. We even included climate change adaptation measures, gender-sensitive measures when you're talking about reducing vulnerabilities. Some livelihood programs, for instance, are meant to be completed in 2020. But in terms of the 167 billion funding, that's for 2016. So that's meant to roll out projects and programs and activities for 2016.
Without necessarily putting the cart before the horse. Will the budget flow go on with or without President Aquino 2016 and beyond?
It's meant, at least the 167 billion pesos required of the Master Rehabilitation Plan, which we submitted, all the plans and projects and programs there, it's meant to be met, even, even if something happens to President Aquino, because he's already approved it. So, in terms of the release, it's just a matter of timing the release based on the availability of the funds with the Department of Budget and Management, because we're still talking about 167 billion pesos, and we have to leave some funds available to the NDRRMC for other calamities, and of course, the other funding requirements of the whole nation. That's why we're placing it at 80 billion for 2015 and 38 billion for 2016.
Thank you very much for the clarification. Sky, may follow-up ka, right? Parang nahilo ka sa picture.
Yes, nahilo ako sa... Ang lalaki, no? 167 billion. So, ang naisip ko lang, no, with 167 billion, ngayon, ano na yung napunta sa Yolanda? Yung beneficiaries itself.
Ano na pinakinabangan?
Pinakinabangan.
Meron na ba?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, as of October 21, when we were doing an accounting with all the national government agencies and the Department of Budget and Management, 51.98 billion pesos has already been released by the DBM to the national government agencies. And of that money, 4.86 billion pesos was spent on the relief phase. And on the rehabilitation phase, it's a total of 47.12 billion pesos. So, yung nakita ninyo na umpisa, if you look at the before and after shots, right after Yolanda, if you see all the debris dun sa mga kalye, it costs a lot of money to do that. It takes billions of pesos. So, dun na punta yung pera, and even Tacloban Airport is up and running again. Several national roads out of the 116 kilometers that need to be rebuilt are already completed, and some of them are ongoing completion. But yung mga ports, they're functioning again. And again, for housing, for instance, there have been already 452 units completed. And this coming November 8th, there will be an additional 400 housing units, for instance, in Tacloban that will be turned over, and about 200 more in Tanawan, Leyte. And of course, ongoing resettlement sites are being built along the Yolanda corridor. So dito na pupunta yung pera na 51.98 billion. But later, actually, there's going to be another full cabinet meeting for each of the government agencies to really present how they used all of the money that was dispersed to them.
Yeah, there will be proper accounting, right?
Yes.
Very good. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Edgar Posadas. Wala ko sinabing delay. Siya po Executive Director ng PHAP. Coming from a doctor, how does PHAP look at Yolanda? What lessons have we learned? What is the prevailing situation in the area?
Good morning, everyone. Pasensya na po. Thank you, Sir Melo, for that. No? Thank you for inviting us here. PHAP looks at it as everybody does. So, Yolanda gave us something to think about. Yung sinasabi natin, we are one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, if not the most. No? And so, even our preparations, I think, attorney here, we also called on PARR before to coordinate our efforts, and also with NDRMC and the other government agencies. Kita natin na nagbabago lahat. So, ang question, Sir Melo, is how prepared are we really? And ang contribution namin as the corporate social responsibility arm of the Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association of the Philippines is actually still on complementing government's resources. Kasi there's a lot to be done, and everybody has to participate. And so, we look at it that way. No? It's a long process. We just went back to Tacloban some months back in celebration of our 68th anniversary. Instead of celebrating, we went there and came up with a very big humanitarian mission, partnering with government agencies, the media, of course, and we have served some 3,000 families there. So, ang nakita ko doon, Sir Melo, is still yung mga basics pa rin, basic needs pa rin ng mga tao. Kasi ang dami nga eh. And government is there. Ang problema nga lang, there's a lot to be done. And so, your PHAP, through PHAP Cares, is there to complement efforts of everybody, of every Filipino that is well-meaning for the Yolanda victims.
Yeah, the reason I ask is WHO came out with a briefing last week, and Dr. Julie Hall mentioned that about 800,000 of the victims were suffering from depression, and 80,000 of them may need antidepressants and anti-schizophrenic drugs. So, coming from the doctor that you are you aware of such a situation in the area?
I'll answer that from a very personal perspective. I cannot speak for everyone, but if you go there right now, makita mo pa rin, nandun pa rin, despite government's efforts, ito talaga, Sir Melo, nakita naman natin that government is there. Problema nga lang talagang napakalaki ang dapat gawin, napakalaki ng devastation. Tayo mismo, pagbalik mo doon, parang depressed ka eh. Parang, ito ba ang binabalikan ko after a year? Pero, it's a lot better. Kagaya ng sabi ni attorney kanina, ang isang nakita ko doon, at least yung pagpasok mo, paglabas sa airport, it's a welcome relief. Maganda na yung upuan mo, kahit na if it's the last thing na gagawin mo sa Tacloban, it's actually a sense of relief. Ako mismo, Melo, medyo siyempre depressed ka kasi you would like to do more, pero hindi mo alam kung saan pupunta o hanggang saan yung paparoonan nun. But just the same, we still do whatever we can to help out and reach out. Talagang nakaka-depress. So, nandun din naman yung mga psychosocial debriefers ng government, ng DOH, and I'm sure Red Cross is there also. They're very visible dun lalo na sa airport area.
But if you have 800,000 with depression, that's more than enough to elect 3 representatives to the party list system.
Lalo siguro ito hindi naman ganun ka-serious yun. Siguro this is from the perspective of varying degrees of depression. So, pag sinabi mo kasing depression, pwedeng halimbawa still grieving for the loss of a loved one or the loss of a house where you grew up with. So, hindi naman siguro those needing talaga, ganun kadami needing that much medication. So,
80,000 lang naman ang medication.
pero marami na bibigyan.
Yun nga eh. Kaya nga iniisip ko, baka mayroong mga malayo at tingin, wala namang tinatanaw. Depression yan.
Nabawasan naman yan, Melo. Nung sa inyo na napunta sa Tacloban, I'm sure the Red Cross is there and everybody was there. No? Yung parang pointlessly they're walking dun sa daan, medyo nabawasan na yun. Medyo meron na silang pinatutunguhan, medyo mas may ngiti na sa kanilang mga mukha. And that's a welcome relief also even for the private sector who's trying to make a little of a difference for the lives of these people 1 year after Yolanda.
Yes. Joe, what are you to say about the health requirements? Because you're into data gathering as well, right?
CRS does not work directly in the health sector here in the Philippines, but what we do try to instill is a sense of community in the way we work, reestablishing those bonds between neighbors and in barangays. That will help people become more resilient and overcome the post-traumatic stress. The other aspect is more through the recovery itself, through the livelihoods, getting people more engaged in reducing their vulnerability, especially giving them more income, and in rebuilding their houses, it gives people more hope. So these are the ways that CRS is trying to rebuild and make people more resilient.
Yes, Atty.
For me, I'll go by a mix of personal experience and some data. But even before I joined our office, sa PARR, I actually volunteered into the Moore Air Base to help out in the needs of those who were evacuated from the Yolanda areas. And as early as that time, it was around December, DSWD and some volunteers already had debriefing sessions for people who were affected, who were depressed. But for me, one thing that I'd like to compliment is the Filipino resiliency. Iba talaga yung level. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, this is really the strongest typhoon to make landfall in recorded human history. But if you see the way the Filipinos reacted, still leaves a lot to say about how strong and resilient Filipinos are, because as early as January, February, when I was going to Tacloban, when things were still not as good as they were now, you still see kids smiling, waving, and even the adults. And there were 14 million people affected by Typhoon Yolanda. So if we go by the numbers, 800,000 is actually less than 10%. So again, it shows how resilient Filipinos are. But when I visited again recently, just this month, a few weeks ago, I already saw a lot of kids again, very happy, but a lot of people also, just as an example of normalcy, a lot of karaoke, videoke. As in, nung nandun ako sa mga resettlement sites, sa mga housing units, at sunod-sunod sabay-sabay na bahay, maririnig mo talaga yung mga nagka-karaoke, videoke. So, again, as I said, we all want this rehabilitation phase to be faster, but to the extent that whatever the conditions are, bilib talaga ako sa mga Pilipino. Iba talaga. Iba pa rin yung resilience.
Very well. Walang lamay yun, pero may videoke.
May
O may videoke. Walang pinaglalamayan. Maliwanag yun.
Sa Red Cross, how do you address such a situation?
Well, actually, kung makikita lang natin, hindi lang natin sa Tacloban makikita yung very big difference from the disaster phase to the recovery phase. Even in other areas like Panay, Northern Cebu, and Northern Palawan, people are starting to go back to normal. As I said, may still challenges pa rin, pero ganun katatag ang Pilipino, and like the authority said, we are very resilient. Lahat nakangiti, no? That's why it is important for Philippine Red Cross when we implement our program, it's always on the participatory approach. It's the main responsibility to for the recovery is by the beneficiary itself. Kumbaga, Red Cross and the rest of the partners or stakeholders, kumbaga tools lang tayo in a way for them to be recovered. It's still important is to make the people be part of it and always having a consultation with the beneficiary. Like in Tacloban, there are still some people who can probably can trace some psychological effect, like especially the loss of the loved ones. But for them, it's kumbaga it's little by little they able to accept that it already happened.
Okay, very well. So, how long does it take for CRS to build homes or shelters?
Okay. So for CRS, we're developing different designs that correspond to the Build Back Better techniques that are promoted by the shelter cluster. There are 8 different techniques to make a more resilient home that's storm resistant. What we do is build a core shelter using a cash grant methodology. Each cash grant is about 33,000 pesos, and then we give a grant of GI sheets in kind to the family. We do this in 3 different stages, and at each stage, a CRS engineer or shelter foreman has to certify that the family is building according to standard. So right now, we have programs in Eastern Leyte, in Tacloban City, and in Eastern Samar to use this cash grant methodology. The core shelters themselves are low cost. They're made of local materials, including coconut lumber, it could be amacan or plywood siding, and rebar and concrete. Everything is procured here in the Philippines, mostly locally, with the exception of GI sheeting, which we need to, with such demand on the market, we need to import.
Okay, very well. Are these homes built on site or in different areas already?
The majority are built on site, so families in rural barangays, especially where it's a safe area, they're able to build on their land. I know one of the key issues we face is land tenure, because many of the families do not have clear title of the land. We know that these families have been living, in some cases, decades on this land, but they may not have a documented title to the land. But we do know from neighbors and from their own history that they have lived there. So as long as a family can say that they have permission of the landowner, we'll accept that and we'll build on the site. We have different with the foundation, others that are built on an elevated model and silt that people can remove. So at the end of the construction, we hand a certificate to each family saying that This house is yours. This is a donation certificate. You own the house, regardless of whether the land ownership is the family's or not. So that family can, if they need to move later, they can take the house with them.
Really?
So transferable.
It's transferable if they deconstructed and then reconstructed.
Okay. It has no wheels. No, no wheels. We'll open the floor to our friends from the media. Let's start with the lady. Yes.
Yes, Ramiro from the Catholic Media Network. This is addressed to all in the context of the unified master plan for Tacloban or the other Typhoon Haiyan devastated areas. From the point of view of the PARR, how do you recognize and unify all the efforts, both of the church, NGOs, and CSOs, such that the people in general, or the Filipinos, will have an idea, ito na pala ang nangyayari from 1 year. Kasi now, it's almost a year, pero people seem not to have a unified view of what is going on in Tacloban. And what we're hearing from you here is, PHAP iba ginagawa, ganito ginagawa, PARR or PRC ganito ginagawa, CRS ganito. So how do you put those things together? Structurally also, second question is, where does Secretary Panfilo Lacson sit in all this? Is he the coordinator of PARR? Is he the big boss of PARR? Because right now you're here as communications manager, so maybe you can answer that. And perhaps each one can also say, this is how you relate to the overall plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ramiro, for that question. So I'll start first with the structure. PARR, Secretary Lacson is PARR kasi the name of the position is Presidential Assistant for Rehabilitation and Recovery. So it's not an office, it's a position. So he's a person. So he is PARR, and again, we are part of his staff that support PARR. And to give you an idea of how underfunded this office is, when he was appointed last December, there's really no funding allocation for him. Kasi it's not an office, it's a position. And by then, December na, so tapos na yung budget. So he actually started by himself, and then by end of December, may kasama siyang isang Undersecretary, Danny Antonio, who is still up to now our Undersecretary for the private sector. Because again, we really are able to maximize efforts by working with the private sector. And sila yung mabilis, that's why we've been able to turn over a lot of projects as well on the part of PARR. And under the Office of the President, we are about 15 that are directly hired by the Office of the President, but the rest, we are now at about 100. The rest are actually consultants that are funded by USAID. So, as you can see, given the magnitude of what we have to do, we have to rehabilitate 171 cities and municipalities. And yet we're a people of, actually, if you look at it, na pinapasweldohan na ng government, na 15. We occupy a space that is free of rent, free of utilities, that is provided by one of the development partners. So if you compare this with other countries wherein they really go all out funding, all out support for whatever rehabilitation office they put up, I would say that what PARR has accomplished is really also an achievement by itself. You look at the size and the funding of the office. And from there, basically what we do to unify all the efforts is actually, we have a more organized and technical approach to this. And this is a database called Empathy. We called it Empathy because it is an electronic management platform, transparency and accountability hub for Yolanda, or accountability and transparency hub for Yolanda. This is a software that was used by the tsunami recovery as well. It was provided to us by UNDP, but what we did was actually reformat or revise it to fit the needs of the Yolanda corridor. So what we have so far is, if you look at this database, all the government projects, pipeline, ongoing, completed, are in this database, and the funding requirements, funding allocation, and the status, including members of the private sector, multilateral, bilateral organizations, that have reported to PARR. So that's one of the challenges talaga eh. Kasi we've been hearing since December a lot of fundraising, a lot of donations, but if you look at what was given to the government only got 1.498 billion pesos. Yun lang yung nagamit ng government agencies that came from non-government sources. So the amount I was talking about, the 51.98 billion, it's actually government money. So what came in as actual donations were only 3% of the amount pledged. Actually, less than 3%. So ganun kaliit. But the problem is for those who give a lot of money, if you give it straight to a foundation, to a charity, to a private organization, we can't account for it because there's no law requiring them to report to the public. So that's the state we are in right now. But to the extent that there are members of the private sector that work with us closely, we are able to track all of their projects, plans, and programs, including the funds, how much they're using, and the status of the projects. And we are really going to make this available to the public through our official website, which we will be launching soon, this November. So yung link na yun, we're designing it in a way na ma-access siya ng public so that anyone can look at it. It took a while lang kasi wala kami funding, so we actually had to sign a memorandum of agreement with PLDT para paggamit sa amin yung services for free. They gave us our IT requirements, but of course, since it's for free, it was a lot of, we had to comply with a lot of requirements. It was a lot of back and forth then.
Really?
Yung second part ng question ko.
Sige.
For everyone.
Yeah. Just to remind everyone, I ask also, how do your groups, respective groups, respond to the PARR in terms of the master plan?
For the Red Cross, it's actually we do regular reporting sa PARR using the electronic management database. So we have a technical team who are regularly inputting it monthly what is our accomplishment, what are the pipelines, and also the budget. That is how actually and regularly we also give a report actually to the PARR.
Yes, CRS.
Yes, for CRS, we do the same. We input all of our data into the empathy data system. It's quite an exhaustive and detailed system, including our funding requirements.
Yeah. How do you utilize IT in your programs? Do you get to monitor who the beneficiaries are, where they are? Do you have a mapping of this?
For CRS, this has been a big push for us in terms of rolling out IT systems, not only for how we manage internally, but also in terms of how we collect information about our beneficiaries. So a very complex program like Yolanda, our total target for housing is 20,000 families. We're tracking each family. So as we register families for in the initial system, we have to go back and then confirm, look at damage, and then when we start construction, we have to follow it through the construction process right through the certification. So for this, we're actually using tablet-based IT systems where we're collecting data for each beneficiary, taking photos in many cases, trying to track the construction progress, and then with data management as well. So we can actually come up with reports based on the progress per household in each of the regions where we're working.
How many people do you have doing the tracking?
It's an exhaustive job. I think in total we have right now about, in our shelter program itself, about it's over 80 people involved in the field work in both Eastern Samar and in Eastern Leyte.
Okay. What about PHAP, sir? Doc, what about PHAP? What database do you have? Are you dependent on the Department of Health? Do you also report to our friends from PARR?
Yes, actually, this is no secret. No? Earlier on, we called on Secretary Lacson to know more about these programs and where we could align. And he's very gracious enough. You know, he doesn't delegate it to a user. He personally accepts an invitation. I was a testament to that. He met with us. He discussed with us. He even watched a video with us on our efforts. And then towards the end of the discussion, we were referred by him more to, because he said our efforts are more aligned with NDRMC, which works closely also with PARR. And so we have a MOA with them on disaster response as one of our advocacies. May not be much, but we contributed 110 million pesos worth of medicines initially, not to mention the succeeding efforts that we did. But our policy is, if you want something sustainable, you have to work with government. And so we work closely with the government agencies. I see Red Cross all the time, of course DOH, DSWD, PARR, and NDRMC. So that is how we work, because alone you could just give so much, but if you work with government agencies, especially on the aspect of sustainability, to include the LGUs, I think it will do somehow a lot for the people of Yolanda.
Very well. Thank you very much.
Continue. Ernie Reyes of Interaction.com ng TV5. Atty. Jimeno, yung total funding is 157 billion.
67.
167. Continuing appropriation po ba?
It's going to come from galing sa national budget, and what's going to happen is we are budgeting it in a way na by 2015, 80.31 billion pesos will be released, and by 2016, 38.93 billion pesos.
Pardon?
38.93 billion pesos by 2016.
So, hindi na kailangan ng congressional approval. Meron nandito na siya.
Yeah, kasi we have the 2015 budget that was already approved. I mean, it's approved by Congress and then it's going to go to Senate already. But basically, the money that is included here in the plans, projects, and activities, in mga PPAs here, they are coming from the regular budget of each of the national government agencies. That's why I was trying to explain na hindi pwede isang buwas ng 167 billion pesos.
Sa 2014, magkano po yung budget?
2014, we're already done with 2014, but the total releases have been already 1.98 billion pesos. That's
So
why
out of the 51.98 billion, 4 billion been really pays.
release base, yes.
How the other recovery
The other
pays?
is for the recovery,
How much?
rehabilitation recovery space. 47.12 billion pesos. So, just to give the distinction, pagka yung mga tents before, yung mga emergency food packs, that's part of the relief phase. And what you can see here is actually a proportion of yung, in terms of transparency and accountability. They actually correspond. When I was studying all the reports of each of the national government agencies, their accomplishments correspond with the money rate of completion there. That's why if you look at housing, kind of say na bakit ang tagal, there are still very little permanent shelter housing units that have been built out of the 205,128 that we need. But then if you look at the actual money that is disbursed to them in 2014, it's very little. I think at the time it was only less than 3 billion pesos.
So for sabi ng PNRC, there are 8,065,000 individuals affected. That's 1.6 million families affected. Sa PARR, ilan na po yung na-recover nabigyan ng recovery effort so far? Out of that 51.98 billion.
Okay, we cannot simplify it in that way. Just say 51.98 billion, ito yung nag-benefit na mga tao because they don't correspond one-to-one. Kasi it's like comparing apples to oranges. Because when you talk about 51.98 billion, this is the collective amount used by all of the national government agencies, including, of course, the SWD, DPWH, Department of Health, TESDA, even the Philippine Coconut Authority. So, really, it's more of, if you're talking about, for instance, Philippine Coconut Authority that has given certain coconut farmer beneficiaries programs, then you can see that number of people that they benefited. But if you're talking about infrastructure, which has also spent a lot of money as well, I think over 4 billion pesos, trying to rebuild yung mga infrastructure, yung mga national roads and bridges, then that's also not quantifiable into actual people. Kasi kahit nga tourists or sino dumaan dito, they're using the roads. and it's benefiting everyone. So another example would be na matataas yung completion rates would be municipal halls, civic centers, public markets. We have completion rates of about 55% and 60+%. Because if you remember, sometime around I think May this year, PARR recommended to the president that the president should download funds directly to local government units for the rebuilding and reconstruction of those structures na standardized naman more or less in cost. Like public markets, municipal halls, kasi hindi mo kailangan ng elaborate PDNA or post-disaster needs assessment for that. Because una-una, alam mo nang sira, pagdalitang-tila. Pangalawa, you kind of know na standard yung cost. So, the point is, walang risk na may ghost project. So, for those, directly download. So, if you remember, Secretary Mar Rojas was giving away money to the local government units at that time. That's why, mataas din yung completion rates for these structures.
Very lucky Secretary Rojas, no?
Giving away money?
Oo, para sa 20, ano yan eh. Para sa 2016.
Hindi.
Wala natin ano ang politika. Well, attorney, kasama ba sa trabaho ng PARR yung pag-identify ng mga missing person o mga dead?
That's part of the NDRRMC, yung National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. Because PARR, our mandate is for rehabilitation and recovery. That's why it's more of the long-term talaga, yung mga building back better, meaning yung matagal gawin, permanent housing, yung mga structures and buildings and infrastructure and livelihood programs that are sustainable. That's why I would say, even if you look at the master plan, even climate change adaptation measures and gender sensitivity issues are included there. Because it's really meant to mitigate the resiliency of the people and reduce the vulnerabilities of those affected areas.
Kasi mag-1 year na, kaya ko na itanong yun, mag-1 year na, sabi ng story namin, meron pang maraming patay na hindi pa nagkakaroon ng DNA matching because of lack of funds. So, hindi ba napondohan ng PARR o ng 51.8 billion yung identification, DNA matching of those missing victims and their mga family nila na buhay?
Yeah. Kasi hindi siya kasama dun sa technically definition of what rehabilitation and recovery projects should be. These are universal definitions, basically universal and international practices in terms of what you include in the rehabilitation and recovery programs. And this is already under the mandate of NDRRMC, and to the extent that they're part of the immediate relief as well sa DSWD. So, those are the agencies that would have to take care of that.
All this effort, all this money, ilang percent na yung na-recover, na-rehabilitate in terms ng mga ginawa ng PARR? Ilang percentage na ba? Fully recovered na ba infrastructure? Fully rehabilitated na ba yung basic needs ng mga tao? O what can you say?
We have to go by sector again. So, if even per sector, kailangan tignan mo yung mga targets and then kung ano na yung status. So again, as I've mentioned earlier, in terms of infrastructure, kunwari for municipal halls, it's already about 55% completed, and public markets about 60+% completed. But I would say for resettlement, maliit pa. Because again, out of 205,128, as of 472 pa lang tapos. So we're actually talking about less than 1% na tapos for resettlement. But again, as I've said, they also correspond with the amount of funds actually used for that. So, I can give you, I can email to you yung mga targets per cluster, per sector, including sa mga livelihood, and also the accomplishments. Ang pinakamahirap i-quantify livelihood programs because you're talking about people and sometimes nag-overlap because we've already given so much amounts, millions of fishing gears, several hundred thousands of bangkas. But then, when you're talking about fisher folk, maraming beneficiaries, but then some of them have received both fishing gears and both bangkas. So, mahirap yung 1-to-1 ratio. And again, because we're talking about also sustainable livelihood, it doesn't mean na completed na sila. Do you count them as completed when in fact, you're also trying to look for other forms of sustainable livelihood for them? So, mahirap the targets are really moving and changing by the day.
Doon sa relief effort, nakita na ba yung nawawalang spam sa mga relief battle?
That's a question for DSWD.
Unfortunately, last minute, the SWD backed out from our forum. For reasons I really don't know. Dahil nagkaroon daw ng sudden change in schedule. So nobody from the SWD will come today. But we extended the invitation with this.
Pat Santos, Daily Tribune.
Uy! Happy Easter, Pat.
Ito series pa. Ano mangyayari ng PARR after 9/9/10? Meron ba kayong specific yung tenure? Up to when? Kasi hindi natin masisiguro, baka next month may another Yolanda. What will happen to PARR kung sakali?
Beyond 2016.
That would be that PARR's office will be dissolved. Kasi it is co-terminus. The position is co-terminus with the term of the President. Kasi, again, it is under the office of the President and it is a position called the Presidential Assistant for Rehabilitation and Recovery created by a memorandum order. So, by 2016, the office will cease to exist in co-terminus dun sa term ng ating current President. But again, what we're striving to do as early as now is to develop best practices that hopefully can be adopted by the next administration or even in next calamities. Kasi the mandate of PARR only covers the Yolanda corridor, meaning those areas that were directly affected by Typhoon Yolanda. But what we're trying to do in terms of transparency, that empathy system that I mentioned, we actually hope that this will be adopted for future calamities so that the public can always see what projects and programs are being implemented by the government, how much money they're using, and how much funding requirements are still lacking, and what's the status. And we actually hope that beyond disasters, this can also be used for other government projects. Because we sometimes see, for instance, a road being built. We don't know where the funds came from, how much is actually being used there, how much was the document signed allotting money for that. Diba? It can be overpriced, but we don't know anything. So we hope these practices can really be used beyond Yolanda. And even, just as an example, multi-hazard mapping. It's one of the things that we've also initiated. That's why we have a memorandum of agreement with NAMRIA. Because on a scale of 1 to 10,000, we want to identify all the hazards that an area is susceptible to. Because this is part of what the doctor said, is part of sustainability and disaster risk reduction. Because you cannot, as a local government unit, strategically plan for disasters if you don't know the hazards that you are exposed to. I was talking to a councilor from Tacloban. She said they were actually prepared with a lot of relief goods before Yolanda arrived, but then they did not foresee the storm surge because they did not even know that they were susceptible to a storm surge. So all the relief goods were washed away by the storm surge. So this is what we hope to provide to all local government units so that whatever happens to our office, even if tomorrow we are dissolved, then at least we are able to leave some best practices that hopefully can be adopted by the next administration or any other organization that can be set up for disasters.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just ask Joe. It says here, according to OCHA, we have 25,000 people living in transitional sites. How many homes did you say have you?
As a note for the 5,000 families, 25,000 people in transitional sites. These are, I believe, the bunkhouses or and other transitional sites that are meant to relocate people temporarily. There are also several hundred families living in tents who are being transferred to transitional sites, I believe, this week. This is a very small number compared to the overall caseload. I think when we do assessments, for example, the shelter cluster did an assessment last August and found out that the majority of families still are in need of external assistance to self-recover. So it's still, this number is fairly small compared to the overall caseload. I think it's closer to around 95,000 families who need external assistance to rebuild their homes.
Very well. Mr. Red Cross,
WHO reported 180,000 births for the year since Yolanda struck. How do you look at it? 180,000 babies born. Ano, ninervyos siya kaya na nag-buntis.
Well, siguro hindi ko. Actually, I cannot answer that specific now. Pero it's out of the, ano lang po ng Red Cross.
Pero you attend to them, right?
Yes, actually, but what we are doing with the health actually is we do some community health awareness, and we have also program on yung mga birth control or things, and but in the health aspect, our concentration is more on helping the reconstruction of the health facilities. Actually, we have also program now funded by the UAE to have a health facility, a new one, to build a new one in Leyte or in Samar. Okay. On the number of the birth, I think we cannot answer.
No problem.
How about education? How is PARR doing building schools and other areas where, especially the kids now, hindi na ka makapag-aral eh.
Yeah.
Yes.
So of course they're going to school was disrupted right after Yolanda, but actually as early as about a month, 2 months after Yolanda, the Department of Education already started. Public schools started conducting classes again, of course in less ideal conditions, intense or temporary schools. But last week I was in northern Cebu, Bantayan Island, Daan Bantayan Island, and we turned over several classrooms. And this was PARR working together with the Aboitiz Rafi, or One Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated. But apart from that, several classrooms have already been completed as well. I can give you the specific number. I think it's about 800 plus classrooms already completed, and several hundred more currently being constructed. So it is one of the priorities as well from the social services cluster, working with the Department of Education and working with DPWH for the actual building of the classrooms. And pursuant to Build Back Better, it's not an empty slogan. We really try to make them better. So one, meron kaming structural standard na 250 kilometers per hour wind speeds yung kailangan niyang ma-tolerate. And then, apart from that, we also recommended that most of these classrooms can also have facilities for evacuation centers. And also, we recommended that, for instance, hospitals can also be made into command centers so that they won't be, yung mga areas won't be cut off from communication with the other non-affected areas should a typhoon strike. Kasi that's one of the challenges that we experienced with Typhoon Yolanda. They were really cut off for several hours right after the typhoon, and for some areas, several days. So what we need is a command center na hindi dependent just on the local commercial networks. So that's part of building back better, meaning increasing yung ability to respond to disasters and to be prepared for disasters.
Okay. Next question from the floor, please.
Good morning. I represent TV Channel 6 sa Haiyan, Laguna. Last night, practically we observed some people roaming around the city of Santa Rosa, begging from the public. And they're just left there and somebody collects the money. As if there is some kind of human trafficking that came all the way from later. They're seeking some kind of means of survival in the city of Santa Rosa. Is there a crisis management that you handle for these beneficiaries and victims of the Yolanda case?
Okay, so people allegedly from Yolanda-stricken areas being brought to some other place to beg. Have you monitored Atty. Jimeno?
Right now, this is something that one would be the concern of the social services cluster, because that's part of yung normalcy, yung mga kasama rin yan sa food security, and of course, it's a social services concern. But we have not received reports about this, and this is something we can look into. Kasi I think for me, one of the advantages of, my personal opinion, one of the advantages of having a former PNP chief as the PARR, he uses his methods for intelligence gathering and looking into any type of report. So dati nung nakakuha siyang reports on substandard construction materials, he wrote a memorandum to DTI to deputize members of the PNP CIDG to conduct investigation and raids of substandard construction materials. So they were actually able to conduct 3 successful raids wherein they were able to confiscate substandard construction materials that were being provided within the Yolanda corridor. So to answer that question, no, we have not received any reports that there are people being trafficked from the Yolanda corridor to beg here in Luzon, but this is something that we can look into as well.
Well, it's just a spot report for information. Another thing is this emergency phase covering as of October 31, and of course by the PNRC. And it seems to look like the same beneficiaries with a total number of 390,399 received some emergency support. And are these not the same people mentioned here, and how is this translated into financial support? How much budget was allocated for this purpose? Thank you.
This is part of, again, the relief stage, yung emergency phase, and that's within the coverage of the DSWD. So the DSWD spent, I think, around 2 billion pesos when I was looking at the report, but I need to verify that amount. That was one of the documents I was reviewing before. And this is something that they can account for because as of today, there's been 4.86 billion pesos that has been used from government funds for the relief stage. So this would include your emergency phase beneficiaries. And this is a question that would be properly addressed by DSWD.
And there any amount from the PNRC to receive donations for this purpose?
Actually, the amount received by the PRC is different from the government or the DSWD's expenditures. No, it's coming from different national society of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and local donation from private and individual partners. Right now, the Red Cross is actually doing the audit on the expenditures because it's a bigger wide actually. So we still haven't got the actual figures, but it will be available soon.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Earlier we mentioned about the resiliency of the Filipinos. May downside na sa resiliency. Kasi, because being resilient, we accept all outs. Instead of demanding what should be given by government, we just accept what they give. So, I don't think you know.
I agree with you because this might also translate to complacency, which is not proper, especially if you're trying to build back better or if you're also trying to increase the disaster risk preparedness or reduce the tinatawag ng vulnerability. Because kanina, one of the questions of Sir Mel was, what's your take on yung condition talaga ng Yolanda affected areas? And actually, if you look at pre-Yolanda demographics, they were already not good from the start. Meaning, in terms of GDP, their input was only about 17% compared to the national average. And in terms of minimum wage nila, they were receiving only 75% of the national average. So, again, when you're talking about resiliency, parang yung complacency, it was already there before, that they were accepting less than the national average of minimum wage. They had less than most of them were actually some of the poorest areas in the whole Philippines. So one of the challenges here is to make sure that we also get them out of that mentality. So part of the programs here in the Building Back Better is giving them things that for us are normal, but for them are upgrades. So we want to give them actually more than what they're used to. So when I was there last week and I was looking at some of the notes that the kids wrote, yung mga sa classrooms. Some of them were saying thank you because ngayon, now, sorry for your benefit, Joe. Some of them were saying that we're happy because now our classrooms have toilets. And some of them were saying thank you for our new classrooms because now the rain or the sun won't stop us from having classes. Because now, if you look at their classrooms, they're actually better than what they were before. Even their blackboards are concave. Yung design talaga, it's not only high-tech, but meant to be better. So, by giving them, for me, upgraded structures and means of livelihood that pay more or have end-to-end value chains or funding small to medium enterprises through our livelihood programs, the master plan, that's why it's an expensive plan. Because we're asking the government, give them more than what they had before. So I think if you give them those, then they will get used to that standard of living as well. And hopefully, they will demand that from the government.
What do you have to say about yung downside down ng resiliency?
But from a doctor's point of view, that's a reality, better than initially. But I agree with Atty. Jimeno. Ang Pilipino dapat itaas natin ng konti po yung level of dignity even in disasters. It should not be an attitude of mendicancy. Receive ka na lang ng receive. And I also agree with the kind of framework that government through PARR is advocating. Even us in the private sector, we always do that, sir. Like when we adopt communities, we say, okay, we'll give you this, pero you have to have a counterpart. Para may ownership ka. Mahirap kasi, sir, kung if you just take in what you are given. No? Sometimes, and this is a reality, in the guise of charity, we receive goods and services which are below, which are not at par with standards. So in the guise of charity, in essence, nire-receive natin yung mga, well, on-code, mga substandard or you can consider basura sometimes. So for those who have less, they should have more in social services. So, but then again, it's a concerted effort. If we want to raise their level of awareness and their level of consciousness on things, sila din should have a stake and they should have an ownership. At I think yun yung advocacy ng PHAP Cares. We require from them a counterpart. Let's say if we give you half of what you need, can you raise the other half? That doesn't mean though that they have to raise that in cash. They can raise that in terms of services. Libre na yung pagpapagawa ng barangay health station. So, and then we give them incentives, like for the next 6 months, we give them medicine donation, which are also basic needs of these communities. So, yun po ang stand of PHAP.
Sa CRS, are your beneficiaries really in need of homes? Or are homes just being given them?
They're truly in need of homes. In some cases, it's repair of homes. In some cases, they're starting to reconstruct and they need a complement to help them fully rebuild. And in other cases, they're completely devastated. They need a full home. And we differentiate each case. We're trying to give individualized assistance through a cash grant process. At the same time, as an international humanitarian organization, we have to give to the minimum standards. The minimum standards, we call them SPHERE. Those are the minimum in terms of resilient structure that's resistant to future storms and hazards. It's got to be in terms of the number of people per household, of what is the space requirement. So just to meet that standard, we have to give the essentials. But giving a flexible type of program, such as a cash grant, allows families with more means to complement on top of that to give themselves a better house if they can. But we need to meet the minimum standard.
Minimum standards. Okay. Red Cross.
Yes, no. Actually, I said it sa mga point na when you give and they receive. It should be also that we have to think that we need to capacitate the community in a higher level. Kumbaga, what happened in Yolanda may again happen in the future, who knows. But what in the Red Cross we are doing is we injecting in all our approach risk reduction. This is where the Philippine government law, or RA 10121, is all about, is making the community more resilient. no, para hindi yung when there is a disaster, they always naka-receive, di ba? The point of the resiliency is for them to respond and to act immediately para hindi sila talaga as in affected.
All right. Do we have more questions from the media? Siguro si Aya yung pako magtatanong mamaya, pero let's begin with this gentleman here.
Good morning. I'd like to address this inquiry to Karen. Karen, good morning. Maybe this only adapts in your plans we have. I believe in every loss there are opportunities there. And one of the opportunities there is the tourism component of what you're doing sa rehab. I've seen this in Bohol, where the governor is showcasing the 6-kilometer stretch, and there are a lot of tourists trying to see what happened in Bohol, and also the piece of land that went up along the shores. So I want to know if maybe this a gap in your plan, or you have already for this component, because tourism is a very important component. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that input. If you look at the plan, although I think baka tamarin ko pa sa 8,000 pages, but the livelihood cluster action plan actually includes tourism, and we also, the system we adopted was to have each of the local government units, also each of the provinces, so the governors present to us the local government unit rehabilitation plans of all the affected areas. That's why there's about 14 rehabilitation plans on top of the cluster action plans. And for several provinces, kasama lagi tourism dun sa mga livelihood programs nila. And in the livelihood cluster action plan, tourism is also one of the means of livelihood that is being addressed. And there have been already disbursements by the government through government funds for livelihood programs that even includes trainings for tourist guides and development of the tourism industry. Because for several areas, marami talagang opportunities for tourism. Even with Samar, I was talking to one of the mayors, and she was showing to me several areas na may mga waterfalls that have really a lot of opportunities for developing their tourism.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. All right. One last from you today. Okay, from you.
Thank you. You mentioned something about 171 cities and provinces rather, to be rehabilitated, and municipalities to be rehabilitated. How many of these cities and municipalities already have been rehabilitated? And how much more is remaining until 2016? Because I understand from the earlier question that PARR is co-terminus with the President in 2016. So, what's your take on that? Because I really feel very bad that up to now we have not been really been updated on what has been going on. So, can you please give us a picture really?
We'll start first siguro to address your concern that you feel bad that you're not being updated. One of the challenges actually, since you're all members of the media, is the media. Kasi what I noticed, we would have updates, we come up with briefing materials, but they actually ignore it if it's just about progress. What they would pick up on would be controversial issues. So for instance, one time there was a press brief by Secretary Lacson as PARR in Malacanang because he was giving an update kung ano na yung mga status ng projects. But one of them, as soon as he was finished, one of the Q&As, a member of the press asked, are you getting the cooperation of all the cabinet secretaries? And at that time, meron talagang mga hindi. They were unresponsive cabinet secretaries. So he was saying may mga ilan na hindi cooperative. The headlines for the next 2 weeks were just about the uncooperative cabinet secretaries. Blind item, who are these uncooperative cabinet secretaries? Even when I was attending a congressional hearing, one of the senators was asking me that, who are those uncooperative? Parang they get really, I think because we go by what's popular or what's catchy, all the updates that come out on TV are always the negative ones. They highlight what lacks progress, when in fact you even have members of the private sector who have been working so much and have already done a lot. That's why every time they say that the pace of rehabilitation is slow, I take offense not for the government but for the members of the private sector, especially yung mga good-hearted organizations that have been doing a lot already. Because as of today, about 13 billion worth of projects have already come from the private sector that have been reported to PARR. So meron pa iba siguro na hindi nakaka-capture. But in terms of this, saying how many of the 171 cities and municipalities have been fully rehabilitated, I would say objectively, wala pa, because you can say that they are 100% fully rehabilitated, but they are on track on being rehabilitated. In terms of percentage, they vary. Because you have some, if they have very good mayors, for instance, Javier Leyte. Mayor Sandy is a very, he's, I guess, as a businessman, he's very strategic and he knows how to run operations and logistics very well. So in terms of, if you compare his municipality to other municipalities or even cities, he's had a lot of progress. I would say much farther. Meaning sa rehabilitation, they're way ahead than the other. I can't give a percentage because that would be highly inaccurate because we have to talk about criteria. What's your criteria for saying 70% or 60%, diba? But my point is, it's hard to give a specific number on that unless we do a full study and have, again, set criteria for how we say what the percentage is. But they vary, and I would say leadership has a lot to do with it as well. Kasi pwede ka naman humingi as a mayor eh. Pero kung wala ka rin initiative, then you're gonna be much slower than the other cities or municipalities in terms of progress.
Yes.
But isa pa ang challenge, absorptive capacity. Because, again, kahit ibigay namin yung funds, yung ibang local government units, they cannot implement. They do not have enough people, they do not have enough technical capabilities. So, to this, for this issue, PARR has already been working with other organizations to give technical capacities.
Okay, very well. The question is, how many good mayors do we have? Yun ang tanong mo eh. Diba? Okay, before we go to the next question, let me ask Dr. Posadas. One of the things mentioned by WHO was a challenge in logistics. Yolanda struck, what do we do with people with high blood pressure, with diabetes, who may need medicines on a regular basis, and drugstores are closed, money is unavailable. What measures do you think would be able to overturn such a situation, Dr. Posadas?
That's quite a technical question, but we at PHAP Cares, as the corporate social responsibility arm of PHAP, the Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association of the Philippines, ang aming advocacy on that side is actually business continuity. We encourage the drugstores, which are important conduits for the provision of basic medicines to this, especially with people with maintenance. Are you one of those?
Of course. I guess most of the guys here are on maintenance.
So okay, important. That's a very important aspect in that we have to keep them alive for the next at least 72 hours. So we help them. We try our best to be there as much as possible to complement kung talagang nag-shutdown yung kanilang system. We try as much as possible to be there between 72 hours to a week. Para not in lieu of government's resources or their resources, but to complement. Parang it's like for the meantime, we support them by providing them with these basic medicines, and then when they're up and about, then we try to go to another place and help them out again. So our stand to that is actually to encourage them as part of their CSR. To have business continuity despite disasters.
Okay. Do you have studies, time and motion studies to prove that this could be done? Because you have no refrigerators because there is no power.
Yes.
And there are no drugstores because there are no pharmacists. So what do we do?
we have, aside from the resilience of the Filipino, we are very ingenious. We come up with innovative, means within our reach. Like short of an ideal temperature, you can just use your ordinary refrigerator for the meantime. Anyway, it's just a few hours or days. So this is better than none. In fact, minsan gusto man natin halimbawa iparating yung even vaccines. No? If you don't have the cold chain available, then that's useless. So we at PHAP Cares we are also encouraging our members to make available and make functional their cold chain. Like during Yolanda, our tetanus vaccines were very much in demand. And the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Center was one of our major conduit to that because they were able to maintain their cold chain. I'm sure the Red Cross knows this. So doon lahat binabagsak yung mga medications, Sir Melo, na kailangan ng cold storage. So vaccines for one, especially tetanus. So I think if these are made available, then madali na yung pagpapadala doon, especially by the private sector. When it is available, then we come in immediately as soon as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, Madam.
Several weeks ago, I was in Leyte on invitation of an LGU, and I saw a very innovative means of getting the people back on their feet. Sa Palo, in coordination with Pilmico, the lady mayor, the former governor, distributed what's called egg machines. Yung condominium na puro manok na layers. Pag-deliver nun, nangingitlog na yung mga manok. And they have a calculated formula. Each egg costs 4 pesos something to produce. Yolanda destroyed Bantayan, which was the egg capital of the South. And eggs were selling at 12 pesos. So, yeah, in the Visayas, if you can find them. Kasi nasira nga yung Bantayan, saka namatay lahat ng manok. So this project of Pilmico and Palo, patok na patok talaga. Ang problema nila minsan, financing right now, the Palo LGU and Pilmico, the Aboitiz Group, have taken it upon themselves to guarantee yung 10 housewives all together will own a bodega, Are there projects like this elsewhere?
Well, that's a good question. So,
again, so one of the benefits, and this also answers the question earlier about how do we really map out all the efforts, because our database, we try to make it as comprehensive as possible. That's why we appreciate CRS and Red Cross and other private sector donors that work with us to the extent that they really input their data sa empathy system namin. Because even with other people who approach us, how can we help? We have this database, so we actually look at what's available in each of the affected areas, where the gaps are, and ano pa yung kulang. And this project, we work closely with the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation and the Aboitiz Foundation. So we are aware of that project, but it is not available in the other areas. But there are other considerations kasi aside from the suitability, it might be successful there because it is suitable for that area, but it might not be the same case for the other areas. That's why there's a reason why it's not available in other areas. But for the livelihood sector, we do have programs that include providing funds or microfinancing for more sustainable livelihood and for also offering alternative forms of livelihood. And it also supports small to medium enterprises.
okay, thank you very much. Has CRS got any livelihood project in the pipeline?
Yes. To give some background on the livelihood problems from the beginning, in the relief phase, it was mainly all income was disrupted. So farmers, urban, all of it was disrupted. And we began first with Cash for Work to remove debris, get people back into their neighborhoods. And then since then, we've also implemented a program for 6,000 families in Eastern Samar and in Eastern Leyte to give agricultural inputs and also Cash for Work to clear coconut debris from their farmland. Since August, we've moved into a new phase of giving cash grants to families so that they can go choose another option. This is a second part of our agriculture and livelihoods program, whereas they can choose into a program to purchase more agricultural inputs or to start backyard pig raising or backyard vegetable gardening, or choose into a vocational training program with TESDA or DTI.
Okay. And do you identify your recipients according to the needs, or do you accept recommendations from politicians?
We do our own beneficiary registration through volunteer groups in the communities. We do coordinate with the local governments. And
you coordinate?
Yes, and with other humanitarian agencies.
Very well. Red Cross.
And on the part of the Red Cross, we committed to assist 44,000 families on livelihood. These are in three means, like household support, about 40,000, and individual trained skills and enterprises is about 100 people. I'm sorry, 1,000 people. And we also have community managed livelihood programs for about 100 communities. The main selection for this one is it's the beneficiary itself to identify what is actually appropriate for them. We also provide them training, like for example for fishermen, not only giving the boat, but also the materials, but also their proper training and safety. Same with the household support livelihood. In fact, one good story there is one lady who he chose to have a buko store. Buko store, and now actually has 3 franchise buko store in Tacloban.
Okay,
so,
kahit walang nyug,
yeah, it's actually how you see that it should be more on beneficiary identification on the needs, plus providing skills.
Okay, very well. Please.
Good morning, I'm Jerry Kibilan. I've heard a lot of good news, which I haven't heard for a long time.
Right? You know what the bad news.
I'd like to speak on pipeline and ask Atty. Karen because she's far now, and I'm glad that she's there. Shortly after the devastation, I attended a joint ASEAN meeting sponsored by Conrad Stiftong and AIM at Intercon. There was already a draft made by NEDA about the plans and the budget. And it took months for RC Palisacan and his group to revise it. I'm glad that it came out last week. But the thing is, of all these plans and the continuity, that's what Tess mentioned, after 2015, 2016, will there be a continuity? Because Atty. Karen mentioned that in other places it took 8 years to recover everything. Because of the kind of politics and culture that we have, will there be a continuity that we will see our friends in devastated areas in Tacloban and adjoining areas? Will they be able to build up their livelihood, their lives, and everything, etc.? Thank you.
Are you recommending that the president have a second term? Okay.
I'm not saying anything.
Okay. Just kidding.
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question more definitively because again, as you can see with our country, a lot of things are unpredictable. But one of the things that could have been done here is really to create a permanent office. But it would take more than a presidential memorandum order or executive order. It would take legislation. So that's one of the challenges here because then you would have to have the support of majority of Congress and majority of the Senate to come out with legislation and to fast track it, to come up with an office. Because you already have NDRRMC, Republic Act 101-21, which is supposed to to take care of disaster response and rehabilitation. But we've already seen here that that is not sufficient when you're talking about a typhoon as big as Yolanda. Because I think even when they crafted that legislation, it was not contemplating something as big as Yolanda. And to have a model where you centralize all of the rehabilitation efforts in one office is the most efficient. And this has been proven in several other countries that have had to deal with something like the tsunami or the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand. So ideally, something of a more permanent office would be the best way to ensure that there is continuity. But to the extent that the master plan that was approved, the 167 billion pesos, provides for plans and programs up until 2016, that is something that the succeeding administration cannot just take away. Because again, following the process under our laws, once you approve those projects and programs and the money is already allocated, then it cannot be realigned, it cannot be, it would be malversation to use the funds for something else. So, to that extent, at least yung projects and programs that are contained in that plan na pasok sa 167 billion pesos na na-approve, kaya ma-implement yun. But again, for other add-ons, it would be difficult to ensure that with the change in administration.
So considering all these present problems that you're encountering, and also considering the fact that super typhoons are now the norm, they are actually going into a new classification called super typhoon, which we will adapt now very soon, sabi ng pag-asa. Is there any move towards any new legislation to cover all these defects?
Very good question, because I am also for institutionalizing disaster risk reduction and management. And I've sat in some congressional hearings where so far, yung mga bills pending, there's one that is about coming up with warehouses for disaster recovery. That's more on the relief phase. So they're actually thinking of partnering even with big local groceries, for instance, to serve as relief storage or warehouses in times of disaster. So that's one type of legislation that is based on our experience from Yolanda. Another side, at least maybe also affected by Yolanda, was the PARR law. They're looking at how to ensure its implementation, considering one, maraming records that were lost after the Yolanda typhoon, but second, it also disrupted the distribution of farmlands or farmable lands. But in terms of a unified, upgraded version that will ensure that we are prepared for the new normal, parang wala pa ako nakikita ganon. So I hope that's something that we can look into after our experience with Yolanda.
Thank you very much. Can we have short messages from our source persons? Let's start with PHAP, then Red Cross, and then CRS and PARR. With all the experiences we've had, what room for improvement should be given due attention? What are we to do? Let's start PHAP.
Thank you. As always, PHAP through PHAP Cares is always at your service, and we thank you for having us. This is my second time here. And of course, Yolanda has taught us a lot to think about. It has given us a lot of things to think about. How prepared are we for such a catastrophe, such a disaster? And we emphasized earlier on the resilience of the Filipino as a capital for this. And PHAP Cares never cease to believe in that and to believe in that nature of the Filipino. And so we always partner with government, we always partner with our stakeholders, namely, of course, the Department of Health, PARR, and the RMC, even with private partners like the Red Cross and CRS here. We are all aligned with them in making the lives of people better after Yolanda. And I just would like to note one DOH notation here that says, there exists an opportunity to enhance disaster risk reduction and management in health, focus on strengthening the Philippine healthcare system through universal healthcare. And this is also our advocacy, factoring in the Aquino governments and the DOH advocacy on KP, Kalusugang Pakalahatan, with disaster response, disaster risk reduction on health as a centerpiece. And PHAP Cares is always a partner to that. We are always here to reach out, give hope, and continue to touch lives in our own little way. And it's always nice to be working with everybody. There's always room for everybody in this business of disaster risk reduction and management. Thank you.
Magandang umaga po. Maraming salamat, Dr. Edgar Posadas from the Philippine Red Cross.
From the Philippine Red Cross, with our experience in Yolanda, actually as part of the recovery program, we are also doing a lot of scaling up capacity building on our own. For example of this, we are actually similar to what the government planned. We are also having a nationwide regional hub or warehouses to be built, and also because of the experience of access during Yolanda. So we will be prepositioning a lot of emergency supplies, equipment. We're also doing a lot of training for our staff and volunteers. We're also scaling up on our Red Cross 143, which is being formed at the community level to help the people also to respond to disasters. There's a lot of things that Red Cross is doing, preparing for any eventuality again similar to Yolanda. I would like also to take this opportunity actually on the coming November 7, 8. We are commemorating the Yolanda event by having a simultaneous activity together with partners, and also this is done also by the local government in partnership with the local government. No? So in different 9 provinces where Red Cross is working, there will be several activities, and one of those major activities will be held in Leyte on 7th and 8th of November. And of course, as I mentioned to Kuya Melo to give me the opportunity to invite everyone, we're having the press conference tomorrow on Diamond Hotel at 10:30 a.m. Everybody's welcome to attend.
Thank you very much, Joe. What lessons, what will the CRS do?
Okay, in terms of lessons looking forward, disaster risk reduction is one of the big ones, and preparedness. I think what we learned in Tropical Storm Sendong and Typhoon Pablo, and now with Typhoon Yolanda, is that disasters can strike anywhere. Even those who know they're vulnerable, like in Leyte and Eastern Samar and across the Visayas, there needs to be a heightened sense of preparedness. We can save lives if people are well prepared. We can save houses and other assets if people are well prepared. Part of this is also a training component that we need to fill in the gaps, especially at the barangay level, the village level, to make sure that families are better prepared, that communities themselves, they have their planning processes integrated with the municipal level, disaster risk reduction plans, and then they have those properly funded as well.
As in every household, the lady has the last say. So, Attorney
So after Macy's, kaya naman yung masasagot. Okay. Once siguro a year after Yolanda, the first thing we ask is, where are we and how fast or how slow have we been? And to be objective, we have Mr. Sanderson from Plan International who actually said that the pace of recovery in the Philippines, rehabilitation recovery, is faster. And he said there are various reasons for that, but this is a person who actually worked in the tsunami recovery in Banda Aceh. And I would say from the government side, we're still less than 30% done. And I think that's fair enough when you look at how much money has been spent. Out of 167 billion pesos for the Build Back Better that we're targeting with the master plan, only 59 billion pesos has been spent. And also, but I would say I think we've been fast because PARR has been working closely with the private sector, and we've been making sure that they are empowered to mobilize, and they are really fast. So that's why I think marami na tayong na-achieve din sa rehabilitation efforts, because working hand in hand, public and private sector, we are able to finish a lot of projects, including the groundbreaking of a state-of-the-art hospital in Tacloban called the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Center. It's a 500-bed state-of-the-art hospital, and 250 million pesos came from the private sector, and the rest of the money, over 500 million pesos, coming from the Department of Health. But based on all my observations so far, I come from the private sector, and working on this advocacy for the government, based on my observations, the things we have to change are institutional. So, tama si Dr. Posadas, you really have to work with the government, like it or not, because they are in a position to institutionalize change. And this goes beyond the executive branch. We really have to have the proper laws to make sure that we are responsive and prepared. Unang-una, saka naman nakakita na donations na lang itatax pa. Donations in cash are subject to VAT. Donations in kind are subject to custom duties. These are definitely bottlenecks that we have to change. But that's only one of the things that we've identified. For instance, building resettlement. It's an emergency issue. Sino ba naman may gusto na nakabalandra yung mga tents dyan? Because obviously tents will be a subject of criticism. But it's hard to move them out when you can't even start the permanent housing construction if you can't identify government sites and you don't even have an efficient way to acquire private lands in an emergency scenario like this. So there are really so many causes for bottlenecks. We really have to institutionalize change, and this would also be part of the concern raised by Testelina to ensure continuity, which means being responsive to all types of disasters, would mean that you have to have permanency. And you can only have this through laws, so that no matter how much change in administrations we have, we are ensured that we have to follow a certain type of process. That being said, I think we shouldn't lose hope, because we've proven that in spite of all these hurdles, obstacles, and shortcomings, we are able to come up with a lot of progress, as stated by someone who's not even Filipino, that they said that our pace of recovery is much faster than in other countries. So imagine if we get our act together, how much we can achieve. So I'm still very hopeful.
Thank you very much. After all, hope is still tax-free, and hope is eternal. It springs eternal. So on that note, we'd like to say thank you to Roderic Salve of Philippine Red Cross, Mr. Joseph Curry of CRS, Atty. Jimeno, and Dr. Edgar Posadas for being with us. Next week, kami ni Sky, we will talk about measures to assure everyone of clean elections. Baka mamaya may butuhan na naman, tapos may mga magic. So maraming salamat po sa Tapatan, sa Aristocrat, sa mga taga-Aristocrat. Have a nice day sa mga kabatinan sa media. Maraming salamat kay kasama natin, si Miss Pausano, si Marian. We have some giveaways for the media. Thank you very much.